What really happened in the fall of the Berlin Wall? On the night of November 9, 1989, something truly incredible happened. Something that would signal the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Thousands of East Berliners, many carrying nothing but hope and disbelief, walked toward border crossings in what had long been the most fortified and feared barrier in the world, the Berlin Wall. And then, without warning, the gates opened. Guards stood by, confused, overwhelmed, or simply unwilling to stop them. Crowds surged through the checkpoints. Some began climbing the wall. Others brought hammers to chip away at the concrete. Within hours, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of division for nearly 3 decades, was no longer a barrier. It was a moment that seemed spontaneous, even magical. But in truth, it was the result of years of pressure, protest, diplomacy, and one critical mistake in a press conference. In this video, we're going to break it all down. We'll look at why the wall was built, what life was like on both sides, how tensions grew over time, and exactly how a confusing statement by a government spokesman led to one of the most iconic events of the 20th century. This is the real story of how walls fall and how history changes. To understand why the fall of the Berlin Wall was so monumental, we first have to look at why it existed in the first place. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, was also divided into 4 sectors, even though the entire city lay deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. By the late 1940s, tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies grew into what we now call the Cold War, a battle of ideologies fought through politics, propaganda, and power plays, rather than direct military conflict. In 1949, 2 separate German countries were created: West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, backed by the West; East Germany, German Democratic Republic. Under Soviet influence, the divide between East and West wasn't just physical. It represented 2 radically different worlds. West Germany was capitalist, democratic, and prospering under Marshall Plan aid. East Germany was communist, authoritarian, and struggling economically. As life in West Berlin improved, East Germans started fleeing in massive numbers. Over 2.5 million people had escaped to the West by 1961. To stop this brain drain, the East German government, with Soviet support, built the Berlin Wall. It went up almost overnight on August 13, 1961. Cutting through neighborhoods, streets, and even buildings. Families were separated, and entire communities were trapped. What began as barbed wire quickly became a massive concrete barrier, guarded, fortified, and deadly. The wall wasn't just a division of land. It was a division of freedom. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall wasn't just a symbol of division. It was a brutal reality. On the western side, Berlin was vibrant, open, and thriving. Though surrounded by communist East Germany, West Berlin became a showcase of Western democracy and capitalism. Filled with shops, modern cars, free media, and a dynamic culture. It received heavy support from West Germany and the United States. On the eastern side, life was very different. East Berlin was under the control of a strict communist regime. People lived under constant surveillance by the Stasi, one of the most feared secret police forces in history. Freedoms were limited, dissent was dangerous, and even casual complaints about the government could lead to arrest. The wall itself was heavily fortified. Concrete slabs up to 12 feet high, guard towers with armed soldiers, barbed wire, trenches, and a death strip with floodlights and sand to track footprints. Attempts to escape were deadly. Over the years, more than 140 people were killed trying to cross the wall, shot by guards or killed by traps. Others were captured and imprisoned. And yet, people kept trying. Some tunneled beneath the wall, others hid in cars, built hot air balloons, or even zipped across on tightropes. Every successful escape was a reminder that the wall, no matter how strong, couldn't fully suppress the human desire for freedom. Inside East Germany, discontent slowly grew. The economy was stagnant. People felt trapped. They watched the West on TV and heard stories from relatives who had escaped. By the 1980s, the cracks in the system were beginning to show. The wall might have looked permanent, but history had other plans. By the mid-1980s, things were changing, not just in Germany, but across the entire Eastern Bloc. In the Soviet Union, leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced bold reforms: perestroika, economic restructuring, glasnost, openness, and transparency. He signaled a less aggressive foreign policy, and crucially, made it clear that the USSR would no longer intervene militarily to support failing communist regimes. This shift removed the safety net that propped up hardline governments like East Germany's. Meanwhile, East Germans were growing restless. Economic decline, political repression, and a growing awareness of life in the West made the status quo intolerable. But since emigration to West Germany was still tightly controlled, East Germans began to look for ways around the Berlin Wall. By 1989, thousands of East Germans started fleeing through neighboring communist countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which were beginning to open their borders. Massive refugee camps formed. Tensions escalated. Then came the protests. In Leipzig, a city in East Germany, people began gathering every Monday night in peaceful demonstrations. What started as a few hundred quickly grew to tens of thousands chanting, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people." They demanded free elections, reforms, and freedom of movement. The East German government, led by Erich Honecker, responded with censorship and threats. But the pressure was overwhelming. On October 18, 1989, Honecker was forced to resign. His successor, Egon Krenz, attempted to ease restrictions, but it was too late. By November, hundreds of thousands were protesting across East Germany. The government was losing control. The world watched as an entire population stood up, not with violence, but with voices, courage, and persistence. The question wasn't if the wall would fall. It was when, on November 9, 1989, East German officials held a press conference to announce new travel regulations. The regime, feeling the pressure of protests and mass emigration, hoped to calm the situation by loosening restrictions on travel to the West. At the microphone was Günter Schabowski, a senior party member. He had been handed a document moments before the press conference and hadn't fully read or understood it. When asked when the new travel law would take effect, he casually replied, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." That statement was not the government's intention. They had meant for it to go into effect the following day with specific procedures. But the damage was done. The news spread like wildfire across East Berlin. By the evening, thousands of people had gathered at border crossings. The guards, confused and overwhelmed, called their superiors for instructions. None came. At checkpoint Bornholmer, one of the main crossings, the commander made a fateful decision. He opened the gate. Crowds surged through. Some were crying. Others laughed, sang, or simply stood in disbelief. On the West Berlin side, they were greeted with cheers, flowers, and champagne. No shots were fired, no soldiers resisted. For the first time in 28 years, Berliners could walk freely between East and West. all because of a poorly communicated announcement and a regime too weak to stop the tide of history. Once the first border gate opened on the night of November 9, 1989, the news spread fast, not just across Berlin, but across the world. As thousands poured through the checkpoints, something incredible happened. People began climbing onto the wall itself. Young and old, east and west, stood on top of the structure that had once divided them, waving flags, singing songs, and celebrating together. It was an electric, surreal atmosphere, a true celebration of unity, freedom, and peace. Soon, people returned with sledgehammers, chisels, and pickaxes. They began chipping away at the wall, piece by piece. These wallpeckers, as they were later called, turned a symbol of oppression into souvenirs of liberation. Even West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and other world leaders were caught off guard. No one had expected the wall to fall so suddenly, and so peacefully. The physical demolition of the wall took time. It wasn't until 1990 that the systematic dismantling began. Eventually, most of the wall was removed, though a few sections were preserved as historical reminders. But in many ways, the wall's collapse wasn't just physical. It represented the collapse of an entire system. The Iron Curtain, the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and the idea that walls could permanently divide people. Just a year later, on October 3, 1990, Germany was officially reunified. For Berliners, it meant families reuniting after decades. For the world, it was a turning point, the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The wall had once been a symbol of fear, division, and control. Now it was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of peaceful protest. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just the end of a physical barrier. It marked the collapse of a political era and reshaped the future of Europe. In the months that followed, communist regimes in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary also began to fall. The Soviet Union itself would dissolve just 2 years later. In 1991, the Cold War, a decades-long standoff between East and West, was effectively over. Germany moved quickly toward reunification. On October 3, 1990, East and West Germany officially became one nation again. Berlin was declared the capital of the unified Germany, and the scars of division began to heal. But the process wasn't without its challenges. East Germany had to be reintegrated into a modern, capitalist economy. Entire industries collapsed, unemployment soared, and cultural differences created tension. Even decades later, many former East Germans still reflect on the transition as both liberating and difficult. Still, the fall of the wall remains a global symbol of freedom. It's a reminder of how people, power, persistence, and peaceful protest can achieve what once seemed impossible. To this day, remnants of the Berlin Wall stand in places around the world, not to glorify division, but to remind us how it was overcome. Graffiti-covered slabs can be found in museums, embassies, and city squares, testaments to human resilience. And in Berlin itself, the former path of the wall is now marked with a line of bricks, a quiet, sobering trace of history that runs through parks, roads, and neighborhoods that were once divided. So, what really happened in the fall of the Berlin Wall? It wasn't just the collapse of concrete. It was the triumph of ordinary people demanding change, and the world finally listening.